I guess it really wasn't an article so much as it was a list of some just basic suggestions that would improve various relationships and circumstances in one's life. And he said, I think this will preach. You ought to share this sometime, preach this. Well, I was glad to do that. I wanted to wait long enough to maybe he'll forget that this didn't come from me. And maybe I also didn't want to preach it right away to make him think that somehow I didn't know what I was going to be preaching that next Sunday already. But anyway, this was shared with me several months ago, and I actually changed one of the 5, and all 5 of them aren't in that text in Proverb 3 either. We'll get to Proverb 3 here in just a little while. But I thought the list was interesting as well when I read through it, and I thought they were some things that are valuable reminders to us. Things that sometimes we need to stop and reconsider and evaluate that can maybe just make things a little better for us in life and strengthen us in the process. So these are, in some ways, 3 of them are connected in the early part of the study. The last 2 aren't necessarily connected, but they're kind of just a list of things. And so let's talk about them together this morning. And so the first thing I want to suggest to us, and again, I don't take claim to this list because, number 1, it came from God, and number 2, I don't know all the sources that were involved in compiling it. But in first thought, I want us to recognize tonight is what I actually talked about in our Bible study this morning, and that is the concept of honoring thy father and mother. Certainly on Mother's Day, I suppose it's pertinent maybe we take a few minutes and think about this. And to consider the fact that God from early history wanted us to honor our father and mother, recognizing that the importance of that, it really illustrates that if I have disrespect for my earthly mother and father, then how is it that I'm going to develop enough to respect and honor for my heavenly Father? If I'm willing to disrespect those that I'm in the presence of on a regular basis, then what's to say that I wouldn't disrespect a God who I don't necessarily see in the physical world? And so will I honor my father and my mother? Let's go over into Ephesians chapter 6 for a moment. I realize we just looked at it, kind of weird timing in some ways in relationship to our Bible class, but we'll come back to it this morning in our sermon as well and look at Ephesians chapter 6 and in verse 2 in particular, where he begins the context by saying, well, in verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. We talked a little bit about that in our Bible class. And then he says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. Honor, by the way, is something that isn't just expressed. Honoring your father and mother is something that is seen and evidenced by the actions that I take in relationship to them. And the Bible talks about honoring the elders who serve over you. The Bible talks about honoring God. The Bible talks about honoring Jesus and the importance of recognizing the idea of being of honoring those who are in positions over us. And our parents deserve our respect and our honor. They deserve for us to speak to them in honorable ways. They deserve for us to speak about them in honorable ways. You know, sometimes what happens is that we might treat our parents right when they're in our presence, and we may be cautious about what we say and what we do, and we may act a certain way so long as they're in our presence. But the idea of honoring our father and mother has just as much to do with how we show respect to them when they're not in our presence. When they're not watching our every move, when they're not listening to our every word, when they're not there and present to be able to react or respond to what we're saying or doing. Honoring our father and mother has just as much to do with how we speak to them and talk of them and how we respect their will and purpose and choices for me, even when I'm not in their presence. And that certainly has a very specific connotation when I'm young and still living under their rule and under their house. But it also has a connotation when I'm no longer under their house. We spoke out of the book of Genesis briefly in our Bible class this morning about how God said for the marriage relationship that the man should leave father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. There comes a point where we no longer have the same obedience kind of relationship with our parents. But as we stated in the Bible class, we never leave the relationship of honoring our father. That relationship or that importance, that context never goes away in our life. And maybe even more so as they grow older. You know, it's interesting. When you were 20, you laughed at 40-year-olds. When you were 40, You laughed at 80-year-old. And when you start getting to 50, you realize that none of it was funny. Right? You begin to realize that, age takes its toll. And one who was once young and spry isn't always going to be that way. And they may not think as clearly as they once did. And there may be moments where we'd like to roll our eyes and can't believe that my mother or my father has reached such a point where they can't grasp certain things or do. And we've got to be careful. Those are the moments where we need to elevate our honor for them. Those are the moments where we need to elevate our love and appreciation and respect for them. When they're not able to do for themselves as they once did. When they don't think as clearly as they once did. When they're not able to serve, but rather are at a point in their life when they need to be served. I'm concerned sometimes of the things that I see in relationship to aging parents and aging children in that process. You've got mothers and fathers who have spent their lifetime serving and serving and serving their children, but they've finally reached an age where that needs to flip. And it's time for the children to start honoring the parent. It's time for the children to start caring for their parents. And the children are still looking for that parent to be servant to them. We need to be careful that we recognize that honoring our father and mother comes in various ways. And as we're younger, it has certain meanings. And as we grow older, that meaning may change a little bit. And the role may change a little bit. And as we grow older, the honoring of our father and mother will change in relationship, but needs to be demonstrated at all times. Go back to the Genesis account for a moment. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 20, I want you to notice something with me. Genesis chapter 3 and in verse 20. It's Mother's Day today. And certainly we honor all the mothers in the room this morning. And in so doing, let me take you to this text. I don't know whether you've ever thought about what Adam says here in relationship to Eve, but I want you to catch it with me for just a moment. In verse 20, and Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. You ever thought about that? When Adam decides what is he going to call his wife, everybody's got a name up to this point, right? The animals and everything. And so he gets to the point where it's time to give his wife a name, and she's named Eve because she is the mother of all living. You ever hear a child say to an older woman, say, "You're not my mom." Oh, yes, she is. According to Genesis chapter 3, verse 20, she is. The imagery here is that Eve, is the beginning of motherhood. The motherhood of all things, the text says. And the point I'm trying to address here, friends, is this. God gave her a place of preeminence. God gave her a place of blessing. God gave her a place of high esteem, and she needs to be recognized as such. The very first mother, Eve, was considered the mother of all things. And she should be honored as such. And it's important for us to recognize, honor thy father and mother. We could talk about fathers, but we'll wait for Father's Day maybe to say some things about that. But this morning, I want us to realize how important it is for us to honor our own mothers and to honor all mothers, as they became the mother of all things the moment Adam says she is Eve on that great day. Well, the second thing I want you to consider with me here this morning is this. Honor your father and mother, children to parent. But now spouse to spouse. I saw this, and this isn't exactly how, by the way, the list wrote it, but I'm going to put it this way. When he said, spoil your spouse, not your children. We're not very good at that. And I suppose it comes from a pureness, right? I'm not judging that. What I'm saying is, I think that as parents, that's kind of what we want to do. We want our children to have, and if it means sacrificing, then I'm willing to sacrifice because I want, and I get that. Okay, I get that. But sometimes what we do is we become so focused upon the children in the room that we forget there's a marriage in the room that also needs attention and care, that also needs some focus. And particularly to men this morning, since that's kind of the angle of the moment, then let me encourage you, spoil your wife, not just your children. And care for her in such a way that she can recognize the importance that she is to you, to the family, to her children. The proverb writer wrote in Proverb 5 and verse 18, "Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of your youth." I want you to go back. Go back. And I know for some of us it'll be harder, but you got to go back many more years. But I want you to go back to those early days of dating and those early days of marriage. And I want you to stop and think about all the things that you went and did. Deborah and I, one time before we had children, jumped in a car, drove 3 hours to a basketball game, not to watch somebody play it, but to watch her brother referee it. And you probably have something like that too, right? Because it's all you had. It was you and her, and you just did. And then Sam was born. And it was wonderful and great. And really wasn't all that taxing. One child, right? We can handle this. And got lots of help. He's got about 82 mothers up and fathers up there at Cedar Avenue. And he's got tons of grandparents. And you know, it's all good. And then Isaac came. And that was a little more troublesome in terms of trying to take care of two. And then Rachel came. And then they grew up. And every step of the way, they needed more attention and more attention and more attention and more focus and more attention and more focus. And I'll admit it's easy to become so wrapped up in that you can forget the wife of your youth. And that's a mistake. Deborah needs to understand she's just as important to me now as she was July 22nd, 1995. Yes, I do know the date. Many of you were here. Don't forget the wife of your youth. And I realize you may not be as spry as you once were. Maybe you can't go walk a trail for 25 miles like you once did. Or you might not be able to jump on a bicycle and go riding. Or you may not be able to do some of the things you did when you first got married. But you can still spend time together. And you can still converse and talk. And just enjoy the relationship you have with your spouse. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times, and always be enraptured with her love. Wow, that's poetic. It's beautiful. To always be enraptured. I thought about that phrase. This to always be enraptured, encompassed with her love. Spoil your spouse. Spoil your wife, men. Not just your children. Recognize her importance as well. And remember what Paul said about that relationship in Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25. When he said, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her." Be sacrificial. Be giving. Be enraptured with her. Wake up every day just as excited as you did the first day that you were married. Because of the bond and relationship that you've been able to share. And don't let the busyness of life that time tends to bring overwhelm that. Take some time spoiling your spouse, not just the children. And one other quick thought, don't say we'll find time for that after the children are gone. Don't wait, because you could wake up one day and not even know who each other are anymore. Do it today. Don't just say, well, there'll be a day for that. Do it today. Because it'll benefit us in the moment and long term. in our relationship. And I think if we would focus on these principles of Scripture a little more and remember them a little more often, maybe more relationships would be stronger than they are. In verse 7 of 1 Peter chapter 3, husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. I always tell folks, and my basic understanding of that passage is simply this: when she asks you to open the jar of pickles, don't roll your eyes. Right? Honor her as the weaker vessel. I say all the time, I am glad Deborah is not like me. I'm glad she is who she is. Honor that. The weaker vessel, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean she doesn't have inward strength, and it doesn't mean she's not spiritually courageous. But don't disrespect and dishonor her, because there are at times where she might ask of us something that she's incapable physically at times of doing. Don't make a big deal out of everything that she might request of us. Give honor to the wife as that weaker vessel. And recognize your heirs together in relationship to Christ. Number 3. Spend twice the time and half the money on your children. I left that one alone because I liked it on that list. Spend twice the time and half the money on your children. And I think the principle that's trying to be expressed there is simply this, that our children, the American mistake has been we have thought that money will and can replace time. And it can't. We've thought that things can replace time, and it can't. The Bible on many occasions warns us about recognizing the importance of actually spending and building valuable relationships with our children. I want you to know something. I'll be quite honest with you. I don't know, in all the times that I've read over this context and the history of this moment that we're dealing with here in Genesis 44, that ever caught this phrase that's said in this text. Notice chapter 44 of Genesis, verse 26. But we said, we cannot go down if our youngest brother is with us. Then we will go down, for we may not see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Then your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. And the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. But if you take this one also from me, and calamity befalls him, you shall bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. Now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life. You see how strongly they were connected to one another? Described in such a way that his life is wrapped up in the other. Not just monetarily, but there was a bond. Now, there's all kinds of issues right in that family. I understand that. I mean, they sold Joseph off. There's all kinds of issues. But the imagery I want you just to simply see out of verse 30 is that there was a genuine bond between that younger son and his father. Something that was very real. Spend more time building that kind of relationship. There's not a toy on the market that can replace a mother or father. There's not a video game. And yes, your children may think in the moment, and they may even act in the moment, contented with that concept. But in the long run, it is not true. Notice he said, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. I realize that's a proverb. It's a genuine, ideal thought. Sometimes we read passages like that and we say, well, but what about this person who didn't follow? And what about that? That's not the point. The point of the proverb is to help us to recognize that with training, our children will grow into the young men and women that we desire for them to be. But to train up a child takes time. And one of our societal issues is we have pushed that off. I'll tell you a common phrase, and I get it in some senses, but I want to caution us about the concept. We say it takes a village. And that's true, by the way, when it comes to the neglect and the challenges that so many children often face that don't have the help and aid and assistance they need. And so I wholeheartedly agree with that thought. But I want to back it up a step. What will allow us to not need such a big village are parents who spend time training their children. What will aid and benefit more than anything else. And though I can list and I can be concerned about the failures of so many parents, it's frustrating to see abuse. It's frustrating to see children not just abused physically or verbally, but just neglected by disinterested parents. So number one, don't be that. Don't relegate and don't be what I've got to be as a parent. Because that time is fleeting. Deborah and I went up to a retirement party for a friend of ours in Moundsville. And I was talking to a fella and he was telling me, he was reminding me of his age. I said, you realize that you were my age now when we moved to Moundsville. And now you're not. 20-some years has gone by. That's a short window we have to train up a child in the way that he should go. It's a short little window in the span of time of life. And so let's be determined to spend more time training, teaching, educating, encouraging, edifying, admonishing, nurturing. Let's be devoted to spending more time there than trying to find the cash to buy the best toys known to man. Because our children need us, not just things. The Ephesian writer Paul said in Ephesians 5 in verse 16. In Ephesians 5 and in verse 16 where he said, redeem the time, or redeeming the time because the days are evil. We need to redeem the time and take care of this now while we have opportunity. Number 4. And here's where we transition a little bit. We need to spend more time sharing good and withholding negative. And what I mean by that is that and the writer of the list, whomever that was emphasizing the idea that if you hear something good, share it. If you hear something negative, don't. They recognize that people need to be encouraged. Now let's go. And I apologize, I should have picked a different reading for Gary. This used to be the first point, and then I rearranged it, but I didn't change the reading. But Proverb 3 and verse 27. Let's go back to this just for a moment. Proverb 3, verse 27. And that's the verse I really want to focus on. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in the power of your hand to do so. Do not withhold good to those or to whom it is due. When you have the ability to do something good for another, when you have the ability to share in something that's positive and good and edify and encourage, do it. When it's within your power to do that. Do not say to your neighbor, verse 28, do not say to your neighbor, go and come back and tomorrow I will give it, when you have it with you. You know why? And it's interesting. You know why that's true? So my neighbor asked me for a pen. And I saw it. That's why I'm using it. But he asked me for a pen, and I've got the pen in my pocket. And I say to him, well, okay, I'll be glad to loan you a pen. Go on home, come back and see me tomorrow, and I'll lend it to you. What's that about? Is that about helping him and doing good, or is that about power and control over that individual? Well, that's about power and control, right? It's about forcing him to jump through hoops in order to help it. When I've got the pen in my pocket the whole time. What the writer's trying to get us to see is when the moment is there and the good can be produced, then do it. Don't wait for tomorrow. Don't try to control the circumstance. Don't feel like that you have to have some kind of power over that moment. Just do the good that is needed. Do not devise evil, verse 29, against your neighbor, for he dwells by you for safety's sake. That was very real to them, by the way. I don't know that it's so much as real, but I like the fact that our neighbors watch out for one another. My neighbor across the street don't dare park on our street for longer than about a minute and a half. He'll be out there asking you what you're doing. And I appreciate that about it. Because he doesn't let folks just linger around and sit around the neighborhood without at least a simple explanation of, why are you sitting out in front of my house? But we don't necessarily have exactly the same kind of safety issues as they did back then. Do not devise evil. He's there to help you. He's there to be a benefit. Do what is good. Share what you have in the moment that you can. And don't be finding evil ways to hurt. Do not strive with a man without cause if he has done you no harm. I'm one of those guys that has to be kindly reminded of whether or not, Brian, does this really affect you or not? Is this really something that affects you? Because I tend to borrow trouble. I'm one of those guys that tends to, and what I mean by that is that I tend to just bring it all, right? I'll consider, sure, okay, let's consider that. When the truth of the matter is, half of it probably doesn't have any bearing on me whatsoever. And sometimes I've got to learn to just let that go. Just let it go. I'm not talking about somebody's sinful practice. I'm not talking about letting somebody condemn their soul and their conduct. But there are times where we just need to let it go. If it hasn't done you any harm, is it really something that I need to be reacting to and responding to? And don't be jealous over the oppressors or envious of them. Choose none of his ways, for the perverse person is an abomination to the Lord. But his secret counsel is with the upright. Do good and get away from the evil. If you have something good to say about somebody, if you have some good to render or help or to edify or encourage, then do it. Do that. But put away the negative. Quit talking bad about people. That's what the Proverbs say. Quit saying evil things about others. Quit perpetuating evil thoughts and evil concerns about others. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. Galatians chapter 6 and in verse 10. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Let's focus on the good and put away the evil. And the fifth one then, we need to spend less time trying to be liked and more time liking people. And may I suggest to you that those things will actually mutually benefit the other? Sometimes we spend all our effort and energy trying to make people like us. We spend all of our efforts and time and energies, and we're trying to compel people that I'm worthy of being liked. When the fact of the matter is, the best way to do that is to simply show your interest in love and compassion, and that you're interested in other people. And it generally gets reciprocated. Not always, but generally. In John chapter 13 and in verse 35. In John chapter 13 and verse 35. Jesus said, "By this all will know that ye are my disciples, if you have love one for another." Show your love for others. Be kind to others. Speak well of others. Seek their good. Edify. Encourage. Be that kind of person, and you'll be liked. Not by everybody, but from those that matter. Be loving and kind and courteous, and show expressions of love and kindness towards others. Don't just seek people's approval, Because when we're striving to simply seek the approval of others, what we end up doing is compromising principles and teachings of God that we shouldn't be compromising. And we'll become so focused on the idea of whether or not somebody likes me, and they've got to like me in the way that they, and we don't live out and conduct ourselves in the manner that God would want. Verse 22 of 1 Peter chapter 1. Since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit in sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently, with a pure heart, having been born again not of corruptible seed, but incorruptible, through the Word of God, which lives and abides forever. Because all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of the grass. The grass withers and the flowers fall away, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Now this is the word which by the gospel was preached to you. We've been changed by the gospel. We've been purified by the gospel. Our lives are far different now. Just live the life of a child of God. Just live and honor the life of a child of God, and let that experience draw the interest of others. And remember what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 17 when he says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Our job again is not to try to figure out how to lure people into liking us, but how much love and compassion do I have for others? How much honor do I demonstrate towards others? That'll improve my life. That will help and aid me in my relationships. 5 simple suggestions for you this morning. Simple in thought, hard sometimes maybe to apply. But I hope these 5 things will just make our days better, our relationships better, and ultimately our community and our world better. Because we've spent time striving to honor the principles of God that help and aid and assist us in so many other walks of life. If you're subject to the gospel in some way this morning, if we can encourage you, edify you to step into the promises of Jesus, to recognize there's no greater relationship that you can ever have than to have one with the Father above through Jesus the Son. You've never experienced the remission of sins or need to come and be baptized into Christ, or we can encourage you to repent and turn and pray for you tonight. Whatever we could do to strengthen you in your relationship with God, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?